I want you to try and imagine something with me for a second. Picture an entire continent.
Okay, a whole continent.
Right. A vast, sprawling landmass that is just incredibly rich with every natural resource you could possibly dream of. You know, mountains shimmering with veins of silver, dense forests, weeping rubber, fertile earth practically bursting with sugar and coffee, and like deep underground reservoirs of oil.
It's like an absolute gold mine, literally.
Literally. But now imagine that this entire continent has been structured, engineered, really for centuries, with one single overriding purpose. And that purpose is just to feed the wealth of others.
Right, which is completely counterintuitive.
It really is. Imagine a place where the Earth's incredible riches somehow, inevitably, translate directly into the grinding poverty of the people who actually live there. It's a place where abundance literally equals deprivation.
It forces us to confront this really profound paradox about how global wealth is actually generated. I mean, we're talking about regions that should, by all geographical logic, be the wealthiest places on the planet, yet they function as the engine room for prosperity located half a world away.
Exactly. So welcome to the deep dive. We are so incredibly glad you are here with us today.
Absolutely.
Our mission for this conversation is to explore the profound impact of Latin American colonialism. We're getting into the ongoing systemic economic dependency of the region, the historical role of the United States in shaping that reality, and the incredibly complex, often heartbreaking ethical ways that colonized people have attempted to reclaim their own agency.
It is a massive, massive topic.
It is. And to navigate something this big, we need a really solid blueprint. So instead of just looking at a timeline of dates, we are going to layer several different lenses on top of each other.
Which I think is the only way to really do this justice.
Right. We are starting with the foundational macroeconomic history found in the seminal book Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. Then we will look at how those economic theories manifest in modern geopolitics.
And for that, we're using a really interesting article titled Move On from Washington's Outdated Cuba Policy by Daniel DePetris, which was published by Defense Priorities.
Yeah, alongside a broader document simply titled United States and Latin America.
But, you know, because pure economics can sometimes feel a bit detached from human reality, we are also bringing in cultural and philosophical analyses.
Oh, the film critique parts are fascinating.
They really are. We will be looking at two pieces of film critique about the 1969 movie Burn. The first is called Social Movements, Clichés and Educational Networks in the movie Burn, by Joana Ribeiro dos Santos, Rebecca Silva Brandon Rosa, and Nilda Alves.
And the second one is a piece titled Telescopic Relationality, Visualizing the Archipelagic Americas in Burn, by an unnamed author.
Right. And finally, we will synthesize all of this with a deep philosophical paper called Towards a Critique of Colonial Violence, Fanon, Gandhi, and the Restoration of Agency, by Neelam Srivastava.
It is a phenomenal stack of sources, but before we pull the thread on that first idea, I want to give you, our listener, a quick heads up on how we are going to handle this.
Yeah, this is an important point to clarify.
Because our source material contains highly politically charged topics. I mean, we are talking about Marxist economic critiques of global capitalism, intense debates over United States foreign policy, and the deeply heavy ethics of violent resistance. We have a strict ground rule for ourselves today.
We will be impartially reporting on this content.
Exactly. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we taking sides. Our job today is merely to convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
We're just exploring the logic and the argument so that you can fully understand the perspectives being offered by the authors.
Right. Our goal is illumination, not persuasion. We want to map out the architecture of these arguments so you can see how the authors construct their worldviews.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational concept of the open veins.
Yeah. Eduardo Galeano's famous metaphor paints Latin America as a region perpetually bleeding out its resources. When I was reading this, the image that kept coming to my mind was that of a menial worker in a massive, sprawling factory.
Oh, that's a good way to visualize it.
Right. The worker is surrounded by the most valuable materials imaginable. They're handling gold, assembling intricate electronics, but they take home a minimum wage while the factory owner reaps these massive profits.
It's that dark irony Galeano points out.
Yeah, the region is spectacularly rich in resources. Gold, silver, sugar, rubber, oil. Yet those very resources are exactly what cursed the region to poverty. It feels totally counterintuitive. Usually if you strike oil or find gold, you are set.
Well, Galeano flips that intuitive logic right on its head. To understand his argument, we really have to look at his core thesis regarding underdevelopment.
Because we hear that term all the time, right? Developing nation.
Exactly. And that term implies a trajectory. It suggests that a country is simply in a preliminary stage, like a teenager waiting to become an adult. And with enough time and good behavior, they will naturally arrive at the status of a developed nation.
But Galeano is saying that's just a myth.
He outright rejects it. He argues that underdevelopment in Latin America is not a phase, it is the direct, necessary consequence of other nations' development.
He actually describes it as the universal gearbox of capitalism. So the prosperity of the wealthy nations actually requires the poverty of Latin America. It is not a glitch in the system.
No, it is the system working exactly as designed. He details how, within this global machine, Latin America was historically assigned a very specific structural function.
Which was exporting cheap raw materials.
Right, exporting cheap raw materials and, crucially, cheap labor. The system was engineered by the foreign metropolis of the moment.
Whether that was Spain or Portugal early on, or the United Kingdom, or later the United States.
Exactly. The goal was always to siphon wealth outward. Galeano refers to this as the alchemy of colonialism.
Right, which is such a powerful phrase. Because when we think of alchemy, we think of turning lead into gold. But Galeano is describing a reverse alchemy here.
It's totally reversed.
The natural gold of the land is transformed into scrap metal for the people who live there. And the abundant food grown on the land turns into poison for the locals because it is entirely exported while they literally starve.
The sources mention the haunting ghost towns left behind after this extraction process finishes. This is where that reverse alchemy becomes highly visible. We can look at Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico.
Those were the silver mining towns, right?
Yeah. Centuries ago, these were booming centers of silver mining. They were some of the wealthiest, most populous cities in the entire world. They were built entirely around the extraction of silver that essentially financed the development of Europe.
Wow. But then the silver ran out.
Right. Once the silver veins were exhausted, the foreign capital simply packed up and left. What remains today in those places are desolate warrens of deep, empty tunnels and immense generational poverty.
It is like strip mining in economy's topsoil. It is not just that the silver was taken, it is that the very foundation required to grow anything else was permanently destroyed.
They didn't leave anything useful behind.
No, they did not build universities or diverse internal markets or sustainable infrastructure. They just built systems to get the silver out to the coast as fast as humanly possible.
And when the silver was gone, the region was left completely barren and dependent.
The exact same thing happened in northeast Brazil with the sugar trade and in the Amazon with the river forests. Explosive temporary wealth that ultimately left the regions completely destitute once the foreign investors found a cheaper or more lucrative location in Asia or Africa.
And Galeano traces this mechanism straight through to the modern era. The galleons stopped sailing, but the structural extraction continued under what he describes as neocolonialism.
Driven by multinational corporations and modern foreign policy.
Exactly. The mechanism simply evolved. For instance, the text discusses the latifundio system, which perfectly illustrates how this extraction continues to choke internal growth today.
Oh, the statistics Galeano provides on the latifundio system are just staggering. A latifundio is a massive, privately owned agricultural estate. And he notes that roughly 1.5% of agricultural landlords own half of all the cultivable land in Latin America.
1.5% owning 50% of the land.
Yes, that is the ultimate economic bottleneck. But I want to dig into the actual mechanics of why that is so damaging. It is not just unfair, it mathematically prevents a modern economy from forming.
Well, think about it from the landlord's perspective. If you were one of those landowners, holding 500,000 acres and relying on an endless supply of dirt-cheap, desperately poor labor, you have absolutely zero financial incentive to innovate.
Right, why buy a machine when human sweat is cheaper?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You do not need to buy tractors or invest in advanced agricultural technology because human labor is cheaper than a machine. Because you are not buying tractors, no one builds a tractor factory in your country.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right, because there is no factory, there is no need for a middle class of mechanics, engineers, or managers. The purchasing power of the entire population is kept at near zero.
Because if the vast majority of the people are paid starvation wages on these latifundios, they cannot afford to buy consumer goods, so domestic industries simply cannot grow.
You can't sell things to people who have no money.
You cannot start a business selling shoes or radios or bicycles if 90% of the population cannot afford to buy them. The economy remains entirely locked into exporting raw materials to foreign buyers, because the foreign buyers are the only ones with any money.
And the text also brings institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank into this critique. Galeano argues that these international credit organizations, which are often heavily influenced by the United States and European powers, perpetuate this dynamic through debt.
Debt becomes the new chains.
Precisely. When Latin American countries attempt to modernize or build infrastructure, they are forced to take on massive foreign loans. But the terms of these loans, according to the source, often require the borrowing countries to reshape their entire internal economies to prioritize the repayment of that foreign debt above all else.
The source claims that the hemorrhage of profits taken out of Latin America by multinational corporations is vastly greater than any new investments brought in. So the whole structure operates as a trap.
A very well-designed trap.
You borrow money from international institutions to build the ports and highways needed to export your resources. But the profits from those exported resources are largely taken by the foreign corporations operating in your country,
Leaving the local government holding the bag.
Yes, holding this massive infrastructure debt, which forces them to cut public spending on healthcare and education, and eventually borrow even more money just to pay the interest on the original loan.
It creates a cycle of perpetual dependency. The wealth generated by the land continues to flow outward, just as it did during the era of the silver mines.
But now it flows through digital spreadsheets, debt servicing, and corporate dividends rather than the holds of wooden ships.
Right.
I want to pause here and ask you, the listener, to do something. Just look around your home right now. Look at your cup of coffee. Look at the electronics you're listening to this on. Look at the sugar in your pantry.
It's all connected.
Consider the historical supply chains that Galeano is describing. The systems that made those items so cheap and accessible to you are the exact same systems that have locked entire populations into generational poverty.
It really forces a shift in perspective when you realize that historical inequities are quite literally baked into the prices of everyday goods.
It definitely connects the abstract macroeconomic theories directly to our daily consumption. But the sources do not just leave us with sweeping historical theories. They also zoom in on how this dynamic of dominance and dependency plays out practically in modern geopolitics.
And the clearest microcosm they offer is the enduring relationship between the United States and Cuba.
This is where we shift to the article by Daniel DePetris from Defense Priorities. But looking at this transition from macroeconomic theory to Cuba, I have to push back a little on the premise here.
Okay, what's the pushback?
We just spent all this time outlining Galeano's argument that Latin America is structurally marginalized, impoverished, and kept weak by design. If Cuba is just a victim of this global extraction machine and is relatively poor, why on earth has the United States treated this small island like a massive existential security threat for 6 decades?
It does seem like a massive overreaction, right?
We are talking about the most powerful military in human history treating a developing nation as a top-tier adversary. It doesn't track.
What's fascinating here is how DePetris analyzes that exact disconnect. He argues that the United States policy toward Cuba is essentially an archaic relic of the Cold War, driven by a concept he calls threat inflation.
Threat inflation.
Yes. The United States policy apparatus has consistently exaggerated the actual power and threat level of Cuba to justify maintaining a crushing economic embargo.
So making the monster look significantly bigger than it actually is to justify the massive budget and the extreme measures required to fight it. But, I mean, during the Cold War, there was a genuine fear of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very real, terrifying event.
It absolutely was. But DePetris points out that even at the height of the Cold War, the actual independent threat Cuba posed directly to the United States was highly exaggerated. We have to remember the reality of mutually assured destruction.
Right, MAD.
Given the sheer overwhelming power disparity between the United States and the Soviet Union, Cuba was never going to launch an unprovoked attack on the United States. It would have been instantly suicidal.
The island was a strategic pawn, not an existential threat in its own right.
Exactly. Yet long after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States maintained and even tightened this massive economic embargo and diplomatic isolation.
If the Cold War ended decades ago and the Soviet Union no longer exists, what is the mechanical justification for the policy today? Why does the embargo persist if the original threat is gone?
The paper argues that the policy persists primarily due to domestic political pressures within the United States. particularly from deeply entrenched voting constituencies in Florida, rather than any actual national security calculations.
So it's about winning elections, not stopping missiles.
Pretty much. DePetros points out that the 6-decade-old embargo has completely failed in its stated goal, which was to produce democratic political reform in Havana. The Cuban government has not collapsed, and it has not become a democracy because of the sanctions.
What the sanctions have done is create a profound humanitarian and economic crisis for the Cuban people.
And DePetros outlines how this economic strangulation is actually counterproductive to the United States' own core interests. By trying to squeeze the Cuban government, they are essentially creating the exact geopolitical problems they say they want to avoid.
The most glaring example he provides is the migration crisis.
The statistics are alarming. The source notes that between 2022 and 2024, United States immigration authorities encountered roughly 600,000 Cubans at the southern border.
600,000, that is massive.
By exerting maximum economic pressure on the island, making it impossible to get basic goods, medicine, or fuel, the United States is essentially hollowing out the Cuban economy.
Instead of rising up to overthrow their government, which is the theoretical goal of sanctions, the working-age population is simply fleeing.
The United States policy is directly manufacturing the massive wave of migration that American domestic politics is currently struggling to handle.
It is a classic backfire. You squeeze the economy, hoping the pressure goes upward toward the leadership, but instead, the pressure blows outward, sending 600,000 desperate people toward your own border.
And DePetros mentions another massive strategic miscalculation regarding global competitors.
Oh, right. The China and Russia angle.
By isolating Cuba, making it impossible for them to trade with the West, the United States is basically forcefully pushing them right into the arms of the Chinese Communist Party and Russia.
Out of sheer economic necessity, Cuba has to survive. If the global hegemon right next door refuses to allow trade, Cuba will naturally seek out any partner willing to throw them a lifeline.
DePetros is careful to contextualize this, though. He notes that these relationships with China and Russia are largely symbolic at this point. China is not currently building a massive fleet in Havana Harbor.
But the United States policy of total isolation guarantees that Cuba's only viable diplomatic and economic partners will be the United States' primary geopolitical adversaries.
It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, where Cuba literally has to align with anti-American powers just to keep the lights on.
I want to do a quick impartiality check here on the tone of this source. We are outlining the strategic arguments presented by defense priorities. It is important to note that DePetros is not making a moral argument about the Cuban government.
No, his argument is based purely on pragmatic, cold-blooded United States interests.
His ultimate conclusion is that lifting the embargo and dropping the official goal of regime change would actually benefit the United States far more than the current policy.
He points out very specific, tangible benefits. For instance, Cuba currently imports roughly 80% of its food. If the embargo were lifted, that represents a massive, completely untapped market for United States agriculture right off the coast of Florida.
And he also mentions the potential for immense tourism revenue, right?
Yes, and the strategic value of normalizing intelligence sharing regarding drug trafficking and maritime security in the Caribbean.
It is an argument that looks at the scoreboard and says, well, this play hasn't worked for 60 years. The defense has adapted, and we are taking penalties. Let's try a different strategy. It treats Cuba as a normal, albeit economically weak state, rather than a mythical Cold War boogeyman.
Exactly. But while we can analyze treaties, economic sanctions, and embargoes, they can still feel incredibly abstract. They are numbers on a page, lines on a map, debates in a legislative chamber.
Right. It's hard to visualize the human cost.
To truly understand the mechanics of this transition, how direct boots-on-the-ground colonialism evolved into the corporate neocolonialism that Galeano describes, our sources turn to the visceral world of cinema.
Specifically, they analyzed the 1969 film Burn, directed by Guillermo Pontecorvo.
Right.
We see the United States squeezing Cuba today using state policy, but this playbook of isolating an island for economic dominance is not new. In fact, the blueprint for this exact kind of top-down engineered intervention is brilliantly dramatized in this film.
And the character at the center of it is William Walker, played by Marlon Brando.
He is officially an agent for the British Admiralty, but honestly, reading the analysis from our sources, he operates much more like a ruthless 19th century venture capitalist.
The comparison to a venture capitalist perfectly captures his methodology. He approaches revolution not as a moral crusade, but as a hostile corporate takeover.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He literally travels to this fictional Portuguese colony, the Caribbean island of Queimada, to fund and organize a violent startup, which in this specific case is a slave rebellion.
But he does not care about the slaves.
Not at all. He cares about market access. He orchestrates the rebellion to forcefully oust the old management, the Portuguese colonial government, so he can install his own monopoly, the Antilles Royal Sugar Corporation.
He uses the language of freedom and revolution as a complete smokescreen for a corporate buyout.
The film analysis texts, particularly the piece by Santos, Rosa, and Alves, really dig into the psychological mechanics of how Walker operates on the ground.
He identifies a slave named Jose Dolores. Dolores has obvious natural charisma and leadership qualities, but he has absolutely no revolutionary consciousness.
He has lived his entire life within the psychological confines of slavery.
Right. And Walker sets out to deliberately, scientifically manipulate him.
Walker literally has to engineer the moment of radicalization. He orchestrates a specific situation that forces Dolores to cross a line he never thought he could cross, committing an act of violence against a white man.
In the context of the colony, that act shatters the psychological barrier of subservience.
Walker builds Dolores into a revolutionary hero, teaching him military tactics and rhetoric solely to use him as a battering ram against the Portuguese.
There is a specific scene highlighted in the academic sources that strips away all the heroic illusions and exposes the absolute cold-blooded mathematics of this neo-colonial system.
It's a chilling scene.
Walker is holding a secret meeting with the local mixed-race elites of the island, the nascent bourgeoisie. He is trying to convince them to financially and politically support the slave rebellion against the Portuguese crown.
To do this, he delivers a speech where he compares a slave to a wage worker, using a highly offensive yet brutally effective metaphor.
He asks them to consider the economic difference between a wife and a prostitute. It is a vile comparison, but he uses it to make an irrefutable economic point to these businessmen.
He argues that a wife representing the slave is a fixed capital investment. She must be sheltered, fed, clothed, and provided medical care year-round, regardless of whether her labor is actively generating profit at that specific moment.
But a prostitute representing the wage worker is only paid when her specific services are actively required by the market. Walker argues to the elites that independence from direct Portuguese colonial rule and the subsequent abolition of slavery is actually far cheaper and more profitable for the sugar plantations.
If you abolish slavery and create a class of legally free but desperately poor wage workers, you eliminate all your overhead.
You no longer have the financial burden of keeping your labor force alive during the off-season.
You simply pay them starvation wage for the exact weeks you need the sugarcane cut, and then you fire them, leaving them to fend for themselves or starve the rest of the year.
It perfectly dramatizes the transition Galeano warned about. The new system is draped in the beautiful language of freedom and independence, but mechanically it functions as a much more efficient, ruthless form of wealth extraction.
The structural dominance just changes clothes, and there is a brilliant visual motif in the film that one of our academic sources breaks down to explain how this dominance operates. It is the concept of telescopic relationality.
That's a great term.
When I read this, it clicked everything into place. How does the unnamed author explain the function of the telescope in the movie?
The author points out that the film literally opens with William Walker standing on the deck of a ship, viewing the island of Queimada through a telescope. The telescope is, of course, a tool of enhanced vision, but theoretically, it is also a tool of profound distance and control.
It represents the detached, controlling gaze of the foreign colonizer?
Precisely. It is a one-way mirror. Walker can observe the island in minute detail, but the people on the island cannot see him.
The telescope magnifies the island for the purpose of profit. It zooms in on the natural resources, the geography, the strategic ports, but it structurally fails to see the true humanity of the people living there.
Through the lens of the telescope, the people are reduced to tiny figures, mere data points on a spreadsheet, variables to be manipulated in an economic equation. They are laborers or obstacles, but never equals.
And the sources contrast this highly engineered, top-down manipulation of a social movement in the film with how actual resistance movements operate today. The paper by Santos, Rosa, and Alves refers to the setup in Burn as a cinematic cliché of social movements.
They draw heavily on the work of sociologist Manuel Castells to make this distinction. They argue that Burn relies on a very 19th century romanticized idea that a social movement requires a central, charismatic hero like José Dolores to lead the supposedly ignorant, unorganized masses.
And furthermore, that this hero must be awakened by an outside sophisticated force like Walker.
The film shows Walker literally teaching Dolores how to hold a gun, how to give a speech, how to rob a bank to fund the war. The movement does not exist without the foreign catalyst.
The authors contrast the cinematic cliché with the modern reality of social movements in the 21st century. Castells describes contemporary movements as highly organic, decentralized, and operating through complex digital and social networks.
Modern movements, whether we're talking about protests in South America or uprisings elsewhere, often intentionally lack a single, centralized leader.
This network structure makes them incredibly resilient. If you arrest a single leader in a network movement, the network simply routes around the damage.
But in the world of Burn, because the movement is entirely dependent on this centralized hero that the foreign power constructed, the movement is incredibly vulnerable to decapitation.
Which makes Dolores a tragic figure. He is a weapon forged by Walker. But here's the narrative pivot in the film that pushes us into the final and, frankly, the heaviest part of our source material.
Whoa, this is where things get really intense.
José Dolores eventually realizes he has been played. He realizes that bleeding and dying to get rid of the Portuguese only meant trading one master for another, the British Antilles Royal Sugar Corporation.
He recognizes the reverse alchemy Galeano talked about.
So what does he do? He takes up arms again. He starts a second, much more desperate rebellion, this time against the corporate British masters. And the British respond by sending William Walker back to the island 10 years later to hunt down the very man he created.
This transition from the mechanics of corporate extraction to the visceral reality of armed resistance leads us perfectly into Neelam Srivastava's philosophical paper.
Right. When a system is structurally designed to extract your wealth, when treaties and embargoes fail, and when the very language of freedom is co-opted to disguise a new form of slavery, how do colonized people truly reclaim their agency?
This raises an immensely difficult question. Is violence a necessary, unavoidable component of that reclamation?
Srivastava tackles this by synthesizing the views of two philosophical heavyweights who looked at this exact problem and advocated for radically different methodologies. Frantz Fanon and Mahatma Gandhi.
Both men were grappling with the devastating psychological and physical destruction wrought by colonialism, but their answers to the problem were diametrically opposed.
Let's start with Fanon because his perspective is incredibly raw, and it ties directly into the violent rebellion we just discussed in Burn. We have to remember the context of Fanon. He was not just an academic theorist writing from a safe university office.
Context is everything with Fanon. He was working with the Front de Libération Nationale in Algeria, treating both the colonized victims who had endured horrific torture and the French soldiers who were experiencing trauma from inflicting that torture.
He was a psychiatrist operating right in the bloody, terrifying center of the Algerian War for independence against the French. His entire worldview was forged in an environment of absolute, unyielding, systemic state violence.
Fanon argued that colonialism is not just an unfair political system or a bad economic treaty. He argued that colonialism is a fundamentally violent phenomenon down to its very cellular structure.
It is established by military violence, it is maintained by the daily violence of police and poverty, and therefore it speaks and understands only the language of violence.
Because the system is entirely deaf to reason or moral appeals, Fanon believed that counterviolence by the colonized was the only mechanism capable of shocking the system and shattering the colonial reality.
It is a brutal calculus. Fanon goes so far as to describe this counterviolence as a cleansing force.
That is a very difficult phrase to digest. Cleansing violence sounds terrifying. How does he justify that philosophically?
He justifies it by looking at the psychological damage of colonialism. Fanon argued that generations of colonial rule instill a deep, paralyzing inferiority complex in the colonized people.
They are taught from birth that they are subhuman, that the colonizer is invincible, and that resistance is futile.
At the level of the individual, Fanon believed that the physical act of taking up arms and striking back against the oppressor frees the native from that despair and inaction. It forcibly restores their self-respect by breaking those psychological chains.
Srivastava connects this theory directly back to that pivotal scene in Burn. When José Dolores, pushed by Walker, finally shoots the Portuguese soldier, he has a moment of profound, world-altering realization.
Walker looks at the dead body and says to Dolores, "See, even the Portuguese can die."
For Fanon, that realization is the violent birth of a revolutionary consciousness. It is the exact moment the colonized person reclaims their humanity by definitively proving that the colonizer is merely mortal.
It demystifies the oppressor. If they can bleed, they can be defeated.
To give this raw, violent theory a broader academic framework, Srivastava brings in Walter Benjamin's 1921 essay, Critique of Violence.
Right. Benjamin tries to untangle the ethics of violence from the legal system of the state, which is incredibly relevant when discussing rebellion.
Benjamin explores a very tricky paradox. The state inherently claims a strict monopoly on what it considers legitimate violence, whether that is the police enforcing laws or the military fighting wars.
Because the state writes the laws, it automatically views any violence that occurs outside its control, like a strike, a riot, or a rebellion, as inherently illegal and illegitimate.
The state defines itself as peaceful, and the rebels as violent, even if the state is enforcing its rule through daily brutality.
Exactly. Benjamin argues that we must analytically distinguish between two types of violence. The first is lawmaking violence. This is violence used simply to establish a new oppressive state.
It is a rebellion that just wants to flip the script so the oppressed become the new managers of the violent system.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yes. But Benjamin contrasts that with what he calls divine or revolutionary violence. This is a much more abstract, almost messianic concept.
Revolutionary violence aims not just to change the management, but to end the cycle of oppression entirely. Its goal is to destroy the very structures that make oppressive law necessary in the first place.
Srivastava notes that Fanon's advocacy for anti-colonial violence is often read through this Benjaminian lens, not as a desire to inflict pain for its own sake, but as a necessary catastrophic rupture, attempting to usher in an entirely new, liberated humanism.
Okay, so that is Fanon's model. Counter-violence as a necessary cleansing mechanism to shatter the psychological chains of the colonized and destroy the violent state. But then Srivastava pivots sharply to Mahatma Gandhi, who presents a completely opposite methodology for achieving the exact same goal.
Gandhi was fighting the immense weight of British imperialism in India, but his entire philosophy was built on the absolute rejection of violence.
Gandhi developed the concept of satyagraha, which translates roughly to soul force, or the force of truth. It is commonly understood as passive resistance, but that term almost makes it sound weak.
It was an incredibly active, demanding philosophy. Gandhi, like Fanon, was acutely aware of the psychological damage of colonialism. He absolutely believed that fierce resistance was required to restore agency and achieve home rule for India.
He agreed that the colonized must completely stop cooperating with the colonizer to regain their self-respect. But he vehemently opposed Fanon's idea of a cleansing violence.
Gandhi argued that using brute force to physically expel the British would simply mean replacing British violence with Indian violence. It would be Benjamin's lawmaking violence.
Gandhi famously argued that if you use violence to win the country, you lose your soul in the process. The new nation would be built on a foundation of blood.
So the immense challenge Gandhi faced was methodological. How does satyagraha work in practice? If the state is beating you and you refuse to fight back physically, how do you actually defeat the state?
Srivastava explores the mechanics of this by analyzing Raja Rao's 1938 novel, Kanthapura. The novel provides a visceral, ground-level depiction of a small village in India adopting Gandhi's methods to protest against a brutal British coffee estate.
The key to understanding satyagraha, as depicted in the text, is that it does not eliminate violence from the equation. The violence is still very much present.
But instead of directing the violence outward at the oppressor, the violence must be absorbed by the self.
It requires a staggering capacity for self-sacrifice. The text details a specific, harrowing scene where the villagers march in protest against the estate. The colonial police are ordered to stop them, and they attack the unarmed marchers, raining blows down on them with lathis, which are heavy, metal-tipped bamboo sticks.
And the villagers just take it. They do not raise their hands to block the blows. They do not throw stones. They do not strike back in any way.
The novel describes them silently and bravely enduring the beatings. The narrator specifically notes that as the lathis fell, not a cry nor lamentation rose. In Gandhi's philosophy, this willing, silent acceptance of profound suffering without any retaliation serves a very specific purpose.
It is designed to expose the profound moral bankruptcy of the oppressor. It creates an unbearable cognitive dissonance for the colonizer.
The police are forced to see themselves beating silent, unresisting people. It strips away any illusion that they are enforcing civilization or maintaining order and reveals them as sheer, brutal thugs.
It requires an extraordinary, almost superhuman level of courage and self-control from the protesters. But through this collective, voluntary sacrifice, the villagers in Kanthapura find a profound spiritual victory and a deep, unbreakable sense of unity.
They reclaim their agency not by physically killing the colonizer, as Fanon suggested, but by proving with their own bodies that they are morally vastly superior to the colonizer's violence.
It is an incredible juxtaposition. On one side, you have Fanon, who looks at the violence of the system and concludes that you must direct violence outward to cleanse yourself of the colonial mindset and destroy the oppressor's invulnerability.
And on the other side, you have Gandhi, who looks at the exact same systemic violence and concludes that you must absorb it inwardly through immense self-sacrifice to maintain your moral superiority and shame the oppressor into yielding.
They are diametrically opposed in their methods, a gun versus an open, empty hand. But if we synthesize what Srivastava is arguing in her paper, despite these opposite methods, Fanon and Gandhi actually shared the exact same ultimate fundamental goal.
They were both aiming for the decolonization of the mind. They both understood deeply that merely changing the flag flying over the Capitol building or putting local politicians in charge of the government was entirely insufficient if the psychological software of the people was still programmed by the colonizer.
If the people still felt inferior, or if they just adopted the violent methods of their former masters, the colonial project had still won.
The internal revolution absolutely had to precede the external one. Whether through the shock of counter-violence or the immense spiritual discipline of nonviolence, both methodologies were, at their core, attempts to restore human agency and create a new, liberated human being capable of true independence.
And that psychological liberation is the necessary prerequisite to dismantling the economic and political structures we discussed earlier with Galeano and de Petris. You cannot dismantle the latifundio or negotiate an end to an embargo if you still operate under the psychological framework of subservience.
Which really brings all of these sources full circle.
It does. Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment to tie all these threads together. We have covered an immense amount of ground, exploring centuries of history.
We have looked at the empty silver mines of Potosi, the modern-day United States economic embargo squeezing Cuba, Marlon Brando's cynical corporate manipulation of a slave revolt in Bern, and the intense philosophical debates over violence and passive resistance between Fanon and Gandhi.
It is a lot of history and theory, but why does any of this matter to your life right now, today?
Because the history we just discussed is the blueprint for the present. It is the architectural foundation of the world you are currently living in.
Exactly. Because the dynamics of extraction that Galeano described in the 16th century are the exact same mechanics driving today's global supply chains. The debates over foreign intervention, threat inflation, and economic sanctions that de Petris analyzed regarding Cuba are the exact forces dictating international relations and trade wars today.
The massive, desperate migration crises we see at borders around the world are not spontaneous events. They are the direct, predictable results of the structural inequalities we've been discussing.
The coffee in your mug, the lithium in the battery of the phone you are holding, the sugar in your food, they all have a lineage that traces directly back to these historical patterns of extraction and dominance. So what does this all mean for us?
It means we must recognize that the past is never truly dead. It continues to operate beneath the surface of the present. If true decolonization, as Fanon and Gandhi both argued so passionately, requires a complete, fundamental dismantling of the colonized self and a total restructuring of the historical inequalities, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult, lingering question.
Let's leave them with that thought.
How much of our modern, seemingly progressive, highly globalized 21st century world is still quietly, seamlessly running on the psychological and economic software of empires that supposedly died centuries ago? Have we actually dismantled the machinery of extraction, or did we just give it a new corporate name and a better public relations department?
That is a thought that will fundamentally change how you view the world around you. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep questioning the hidden histories behind the everyday objects you consume, to look closely at the foreign policies you see debated on the news, and to always ask who is benefiting from the structures as they currently exist. Until next time, keep exploring.